The first time Bob Cassilly made the newspapers was on his first honeymoon in 1972. He and his bride, Cecilia, Cece for short, were on a tour of European sculpture and had decided to visit St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The basilica has numerous historic and religious marvels. They were taking in the sights on May 21st, and that very same day, a troubled man named Laszlo Toth happened to also be at the basilica. Toth had chosen that day because he believed that it was the day he'd reached the same age that Jesus Christ was when he died, and Toth believed himself to be the reincarnation of Christ himself. While the newlyweds were looking at an ornate pair of doors, across the basilica, Toth approached one of Michelangelo's sculptures, known as the Pieta. This sculpture depicts Jesus Christ's body being held by the Virgin Mary after his death. Toth looked at the sculpture of what he believed to be his past life, and clambered over the velvet ropes protecting it. He pulled a hammer from his raincoat and yelled, quote, "I am Jesus Christ," and started attacking the statue. As soon as the commotion started, Cassilly told Cece, quote, "I'll kill the guy," and sprinted across the room, getting to the forefront of other onlookers rushing to subdue Toth. Cassilly and a small crowd climbed up the statue and pulled Toth free after he'd severed the arm of the Virgin Mary and began disfiguring her face with a hammer. They pushed him to the ground, and Cassilly punched him in the face. Security showed up quickly to pull the crowd off of Toth. Onlookers yelled, and an old woman hit the security guards with her purse. Cassilly would later tell the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that, quote, "I could have stomped his head once there when he was pulled down, and it went through my mind, but I didn't, and of course, I'm glad I didn't. But the one good punch I got in, I'm not sorry about that." Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. The statue was eventually restored. Toth went to a mental hospital, and Bob Cassilly came back to the States with quite a story to tell. In the Post-Dispatch article, he said that he was planning on making a living as a sculptor, and the paper printed a picture of him working on a marble sculpture right next to the crowd pulling Toth off of the Pieta. Cassilly had just recently graduated from Fontbonne University, becoming the first man to graduate from the school that had, until recently, been an all-girls school. He'd apprenticed with Rudolph Torini during his high school days, and he was already making a name for himself by winning a few contests. He'd met his wife there, Cecilia, and though he didn't know it yet, he'd also gone to school with his second wife, a classmate by the name of Gail Solowada. When Bob and Cece returned, they started flipping properties. Then they opened a restaurant, and in 1978 made enough money to live in Hawaii. They gave it a year, then decided that paradise was too boring. They came back to St. Louis and divorced shortly after. Bob went on to study for his master's, where he met Gail again, who had been a nun working in Africa for a time before deciding it wasn't quite right for her. When they met once again, they had grown in ways that led to a mutual attraction developing. They began dating and got married in 1982. They started working together, and Bob began to make a name for himself as an artist. In 1988, when the St. Louis Zoo built the Living World exhibit, a pavilion for people to learn about different animals, they reached out to Bob to make some of the art. He created a great white shark, a hammerhead shark, a manta ray, and a giant squid. At the time the exhibit was made, there was no actual footage or photographs taken of giant squid yet. So Cassilly told the New York Times, quote, "For details, I used common squid from the local fish market, much to my wife's horror." Animals became Bob's area of expertise. He made the tallest statue in Texas, a giraffe outside the Dallas Zoo, and Bob's statues of baboons and hippos started appearing around St. Louis. Kurt Nickmeyer, Bob's assistant, said Bob could be complicated to work with. He was passionate, but quick to fall into moods, especially for bigger projects. Gale would later describe his sort of manic creativity as a pathology, saying, quote, "He thought of his talent, experienced his talent, as a pathology. That was always the word he used. Not a disease he wanted to cure, but a beloved demon inside of him that spoke and drove him. He loved the craziness and the havoc, the creative chaos that it caused. But he was keenly aware of the consequences, the hurt that it brought, and ultimately, he felt like he had no choice." In 1993, Bob made his famous 24-foot-tall praying mantis statue, and decided that it should go on top of his work building. He would often get calls asking about it. Strangers asked what it meant, and what did he even do at his business to warrant a giant praying mantis on the roof. And he would say, quote, "We did it pretty much just for the hell of it." On June 21st of 1993, Bob bought the old International Shoe Factory. His associate, Tim Tucker, had told him that if he insisted on buying a building on Washington Avenue, he should buy the smallest building. And when Bob came back to him with the news, Tucker said, quote, "Bob, that's the biggest building on Washington Avenue." The building had burst pipes and fungus growing everywhere, and it was in complete disrepair. His close friend, Walter Scott, literally begged Bob not to close the deal, but he was having none of it. Once they closed, Bob and Gale went rollerblading around the lower levels, and later, Bob and Tim Tucker sat on the roof, wondering about the future. They needed to build a fence to keep the site up to code, so Bob insisted on making it a concrete serpent going around the bottom of the building. He started repairing the damage, cleaning the building, and beautifying the nearby area, painting neighboring buildings and landscaping. When the Post-Dispatch inquired about his plans for the building, he told them, quote, "If I was a surgeon, I'd be making Frankenstein." In 1996, Cassilly was commissioned to make the turtles for what would become Turtle Park, near downtown St. Louis. He made 7 sculptures, the largest being 40 feet long. His models were specimens from the zoo. While he worked on the snapping turtle, they kept their reference in a trash can and picked him up whenever Cassilly needed to study his shell. Years later, in 2000, the city of St. Louis put protective coating over the turtles, as they had started to crack. Soon after, a mysterious vandal spray-painted tears on the turtles' faces and wrote, "Help, we've been slimed." Cassilly initially pleaded the fifth, but eventually owned up to the act, though he didn't call it vandalism, as, quote, "You cannot vandalize vandalism." He thought the coating took away from the turtle's character and obscured the details. At some point during his fight with the city, he put up a statue of 2 turtles humping each other. Bob's affinity for reptiles eventually brought him to get a 13-foot boa constrictor that he liked to show off. He once brought it to a party, lost it in the host's drainage pipe, and ended up needing to make her a new bathroom when they destroyed hers to get it out. He lost his snake again later that year, and it turned up at a homeless shelter, hiding in a stack of mattresses that had been donated. He joked that it was quite a surprise for the volunteers. In 1997, the shoe factory that Bob had bought years prior finally opened as the City Museum. It was opened as a non-profit with the help of the type of grants normally given to actual museums. So Bob did his best to make it have some resemblance to what it was labeled as. For those who have never had the pleasure of visiting the City Museum, it can be hard to describe exactly what it is, because it's more of a playground than anything resembling a museum. It's made up of old parts from St. Louis, storefronts and sculptures, and old tiles and recycled bottles. But you would be hard-pressed to find any educational plaques or even a map, as that takes away from the experience. Cassilly's creatures watch over the museum, with snakes and lizards and a 40-foot whale, all melding into the architecture. The St. Louis City Museum is a multi-story network of man-made caves, fiberglass tree branches, and metalwork. Kids and adults can crawl through it, and back when it opened, end up at the occasional educational exhibit about stream ecology, or toasters, or fine art. Cassilly would later say that it was largely inspired by his childhood hangout. When he was a child, he built a 3-story tree house in his backyard, as well as a tunnel going into a nearby creek. As an adult, he recreated this with a multi-million-dollar budget. They have the world's largest pair of underwear, but also traveling dinosaur exhibits. No one looks twice at an adult playing in the tunnels and exploring the caves. And nowadays, on weekends, they sometimes have 21 and up nights, where patrons can get drunk and wander around. Gale later told the State Journal that, quote, "He is like a gigantic 12-year-old. He wants people to like what he likes. So he's made this into a playground for any age. That instinct, that people want to engage in things, seems to be lost as we get older. It's encouraging for us to see people here and see it rekindled." Bob Cassilly was the type of person to ask forgiveness rather than permission. In 1998, he decided to improve a historic wall that was in disrepair. It had been built nearly 100 years prior for the World's Fair. He took the crumbling structure and restored it, but added in human figures holding hands to form the wall. Some citizens loved it. Others were shocked that he would destroy a part of history. Cassilly was a force to be reckoned with, and was not shy about offending those he disagreed with. In 1999, when the old St. Louis Arena was about to be torn down, Bob tried to buy it. And the Riverfront Times said in a later article, quote, "It was never entirely clear what his plans for the arena were. Most who were there agree he wanted to install offices and retail, but they disagree whether the main attraction would have been a roller coaster, a simulacrum of a tropical beach, or the world's largest strip club, which would have brought tourists to St. Louis and employment to the area's stripper talent." Whether or not Cassilly was serious about building the strip club cannot be verified in local articles from the time, so perhaps it's just another legend that's popped up about him. The mayor ended up rejecting his offer, so whatever Cassilly's plans were, they never came to fruition. In 2000, Bob purchased the 55-acre property that housed an abandoned cement plant. Rusted metal skeletons and concrete grain silos sprawl across the estate, and Bob Cassilly thought it was beautiful. He said, quote, "If there were ruins like this in Europe, they'd build a park around it. These are some of the most fantastic things. Look at these incredible works. They're everything a mall in the year 2000 is not. They're massive and overbuilt and ambitious, simple, beautiful forms. There are thousands of these plants, and they tore down half of them." Cassilly's plans were vague and mischievous, telling the Riverfront Times that, quote, "You'll be able to do all the things that were normally illegal, I suppose. Do all the things kids used to sneak into a plant to do, looking for adventure. He wanted to build a man-made river, and get some of the old machinery going again to contrast against the nature that had taken over the site. He wanted people to contemplate man's relationship with machinery and compare it to life during the Precambrian era. He also said it was meant to reflect good and evil, with the stark, outdated machinery contrasting the peaceful wetlands. He also wanted people to climb up to the top of the smokestacks and throw rocks off the top. No higher artistic meaning there, just because it was fun to throw rocks. Bob's decision was partly because he needed a new creative outlet. During his separation with his wife, starting in 1999, he quit the city museum and didn't want to build on the premises anymore. He was still the building's landlord, but was threatening to make his own city museum around the city museum that would be called the City Museum in Exile. On May 6th of 2001, the Post-Dispatch ran an article delving into the marital problems of Bob and Gale, who had not yet legally divorced but were separated. They were both still present at the museum. Bob said he was no longer affiliated, but was still sculpting and working on the roof and outside the museum. Gale had already sold her half to real estate developer David Jump, but was still managing the day-to-day to make sure the upcoming exhibits ran smoothly. As with everything he did, Cassilly was dramatic about his impending divorce and troubles with the City Museum. Despite acting as if he was no longer a member, when a nearby parking garage was under threat of being bought up and demolished, Cassilly took action. Without that garage, visitors would have to rely largely on street parking. So he decided to proactively block off the garage to show people how irritating it would be, and in doing so, he angered the board of directors who threatened to take legal action against him. Bob and Gail divorced in 2002, and David Jump took a more active role in the museum. They prepared to turn the museum into a for-profit business. David Jump had made a name for himself in real estate, owned a grain milling company, and was able to fund Cassilly's risky ventures. Jump preferred to keep a low profile, so how wealthy he actually was is anyone's guess. But he was ready to finance Cassilly's wild ideas. Cassilly made sure to tell citizens that the museum will stay the same, and most of the employees would be retained. Gail left entirely, with the intention of working at a more traditional museum, and Bob prepared to merge his rooftop project with the rest of the museum. During the in-between phase, when it was known Bob was taking ownership, but hadn't yet completed the deal, he tried to bring in construction crews early. The board asked him not to come in on the weekends, and he threatened to bring in his crew for a sleepover on Friday, so they wouldn't technically be showing up on Saturday. This quickly morphed into a slumber party to protest what he believed to be the current leadership's plan to file for bankruptcy, which would slow down his acquisition process. The museum took out and quickly won a restraining order to ban Cassilly from the museum. Of course, this was only effective for the short time until Cassilly closed negotiations, but it did work. He stopped threatening sit-ins or protesting. Half of the City Museum's budget came from grants and donations, and many citizens were skeptical that Cassilly could actually turn a profit once he got possession of the museum. One of the first changes was to start charging for parking, and he put up a sign in the new garage that read, quote, "Greedy Bob's Parking Lot." That summer, he unveiled Monstrose City, and it was a huge hit. It was an elaborate outdoor jungle gym that had incorporated old military planes and metalwork. He joked that kids will love it, but parents will hate it because it looks so dangerous. By October, the books were balanced, and though Cassilly had needed to finance certain museum projects, the future was looking optimistic. The next month, in November of 2002, Bob Cassilly and Bruce Gary locked themselves in a parked car in an attempt to stop the demolition of an old church tower. The police had to break in and wrestle them out. Bob and Jerry had decided to park in the way of the demolition crew. Tim Tucker later told the Riverfront Times that, quote, "One day I was at a funeral and my phone rings. I look down and it's Bob, and then it's Bruce, and then it's Bob again. After the service, I called them back. They said the demolition contractor had come to tear down the tower. They parked Bruce's Jeep at the foot of the tower so the ball couldn't get in. The police came, and Bob called the police on the police. They took Bob and Bruce off to jail." This was the only time Cassilly had ever been arrested, and quite possibly the only time he had ever called the police. To Bob, destroying that church was a crime, and he probably thought it was funny to try and explain his situation to a 911 operator as he was being arrested. The day after he got out of jail, Bob took the Post-Dispatch to see the progress he'd made on his beloved Cementland. He'd built artificial hills, part of a castle, and was working on making lakes. He wanted Cementland to be a place where people could walk over the tops of the old silos and look at the downtown St. Louis skyline from a distance. In 2004, Bob and his third wife, Giovanna, got engaged. They'd been dating since very soon after Bob and Gail separated and had decided to go to Italy for their honeymoon. Giovanna joked with the Post-Dispatch that she'd been born the same year Cassilly was on his first honeymoon in Italy. She told the St. Louis magazine that, quote, "He loved all the things about me that I hated. Whether it was my nose or my inability to think I was strong. He loved and embraced the things about me that nobody else ever had. The first time she visited the museum, they crawled inside of the whale sculpture and hid, giggling while the staff desperately searched for Bob. That same year, the World Aquarium merged with the City Museum, and in typical Cassilly fashion, brought about a bit of drama. An elevator accident nearly wiped out the aquarium director, and several sharks passed away during the move. Once the aquarium opened, their prized two-headed albino rat snake was stolen from the museum before being shortly recovered. Another possible heist would make the papers a few years later, but Bob Cassilly was on the other end of this one. In 2007, the Riverfront Times wrote an article about the strange history behind the large anti-aircraft gun that Bob Cassilly had somehow acquired at Cementland. Apparently, it had been stolen numerous times by different thieves, despite weighing 5 tons, and had somehow ended up at Cementland. So given its strange and legally ambiguous history, it seemed right at home. Whether or not Bob knew the gun was possibly stolen is unknown, but he joked that, quote, possession is 9/10 of the law, and the gun was part of Cementland now. The gun had come from an old warship that had been sunk in the Mississippi during a flood in 1993, possibly as an elaborate insurance fraud scheme, and Cassilly also had his eye on trying to restore the ship and bring it to Cementland. Meanwhile, the City Museum continued to climb in popularity, but this brought about a plethora of injuries as new exhibits were added with sometimes dubious safety measures. During the 2000s, the City Museum had more than 24 lawsuits filed against it for personal injury. Cassilly was not above arguing with plaintiffs on social media to tell them injuries were their fault, and he wanted to put a sign out front telling guests that admission would be much cheaper without lawyers. One incident in 2003 involved a woman losing her finger after she hopped a fence to get to an exhibit, and he told her that she shouldn't have hopped the fence. In 2006, 10-year-old Gavin Kirk fell 13 feet over the railing of Monstrose City. He'd climbed into an area that he wasn't actually supposed to be in, but it was difficult to tell that it wasn't part of the playground. His mother, Michelle Kirk, said, quote, Bob says he likes to give the illusion of danger. No, what he gives is the illusion of safety. Gavin suffered permanent hearing damage, and his mother said that all of the doctors they went to told her that most people don't survive a fall from that height. The Kirks would later find out that Gavin suffered permanent brain damage during the fall and struggled to keep up in school. Michelle said, quote, It's devastating as a mom to know this little trip we took changed his whole life. At one point, Bob put up pictures of the lawyers who had sued him in the City Museum. Some injuries were due to guests ignoring safety rules, but the City Museum ended up paying out anyway. When children got hurt, though, that was another matter. Acquaintance Richard Callow said, quote, He was most upset by the little girl who fell between the cracks of the tram. Bob cried. He had everyone out there with welding torches going through every inch of the place, even the office staff. The incident he was referring to happened in September of 2007, when Toby Munari, an 18-month-old girl, fell through a hole in Monstrose City. She fell 20 feet and suffered fractures to her skull. Her father Brian told the Post-Dispatch that, quote, When she saw me, she wanted me to pick her up, but I knew I couldn't. I got over her so she could see my face. All I could do was be near her. Toby stayed in the hospital for a week and suffered permanent brain damage. Her parents sued the museum. The museum then countersued them, claiming they didn't supervise their child properly. Brian said, quote, I'm kind of offended that they did that. How are we supposed to know there was a hole there? On January 4th of 2010, CBS went in to interview Cassilly about the recent lawsuits as the Kirks were just about to settle. Cassilly seemed friendly, but when they asked about how much money the museum had paid out in lawsuits, he grabbed their camera and asked them to leave. Despite these lawsuits, the museum thrived. He fired and rehired employees, sometimes more than once, and people loved him, but knew to stay out of the way when he was in a bad mood. Kurt Nickmeyer described him as, quote, a 4-year-old with a checkbook. The school bus, leaning off the edge of the roof, was joined by a Ferris wheel and a wading pool, and Bob bought an old church organ to add to the caves in the lower levels. With Cassilly focused on his passion projects, he stopped working in architecture as much, but was quick to chime in whenever the city was looking at a major change. In July of 2010, when the city of St. Louis was looking to rework the park around the arch, Bob Cassilly wrote a letter proposing that they surround it with a field of giraffes. Whether Cassilly was joking or not is impossible to tell. He did love giraffes, but also tried to propose making the arch look like a giant slinky. During this time, Cassilly was having some issues in his personal life, centered around his son Max. In December of 2010, Giovanna Cassilly took out a restraining order against her stepson Max. It barred him from being within 100 yards of her, as well as her house and workplace. This meant Max could not visit the city museum or the house that his father lived in. Giovanna took out the order because Max had allegedly repeatedly made threats on her life. The Riverfront Times would later go into specifics, saying Max had called her a, quote, dumb fucking whore, as well as saying, quote, hey, and Dad, you go fuck yourself too. Max sounds noticeably intoxicated during the call and goes on to say that he thought his dad loved Giovanna more than him. Giovanna would later say that she thought it rubbed Max the wrong way that she and Bob had gotten together so soon after his separation with Gail. In May of 2011, Giovanna had her attorney send a letter to Max and his mother Gail, reminding them that the restraining order was still in effect until December of 2011. The letter alleged that surveillance cameras had caught Max visiting the city museum after hours and bringing friends in, as well as visiting his father's home. The letter, written by attorney Sam J. Alton, said, quote, the multiple threats against Giovanna Cassilly are serious and, she fears, indicative of what may be a bigger problem involving addiction. Giovanna is concerned with her safety. However, she is also concerned with the safety of other family members, including Max. It is our client's desire that those with influence over Max convince him to enter a drug addiction and/or rehabilitation program before his dangerous behavior escalates. No interested party wants this or any other unfortunate occurrence to happen to Max. The types of substances they thought Max was using were never specified, but it would later come out that Max's roommate was attempting to get into dealing marijuana by buying it in Colorado where it was legal and then reselling it in Missouri. That same month, Giovanna went to Portugal, and when she came back, Bob told her he'd been attacked at the Cementland site. He said 3 men jumped him, and he managed to eventually fight them off with a piece of scrap metal. He later told Giovanna that, quote, I thought I was dead. While the Cementland crew would later say that they didn't remember this incident ever happening, Bob told both his neighbor and his massage therapist. The masseuse had an appointment with Cassilly shortly after the incident and would later tell the Riverfront Times that he'd inquired about numerous bumps and scrapes Cassilly had on his back and arms. Cassilly briefly told him of the incident and jokingly said, quote, you should see the other 3 guys. Cassilly never reported the incident to the police. On August 13, 2011, 2 armed men showed up at Max's door just before 6:30 in the morning. His roommate let them in, as they said they were interested in buying marijuana. But as soon as they were inside, they asked him where Max Cassilly was, and when they found him, they shot Max in the arms and legs with an assault rifle. Police officers apprehended John Henry Blake later that day, who was in a black Hummer, the type of vehicle the assailants had driven. The other assailant got away, but Blake was taken into custody. Authorities initially told the media that the gunmen were probably familiar with the house, possibly Max himself, and that the attack had been a robbery attempt. They later speculated that it could have been a personal attack as well, and said there was more to the incident than they had previously thought, which was vague enough to get the papers speculating. Max spent over a week in the ICU. Bob Cassilly told the Post-Dispatch when he finally returned the media's calls that, quote, "I'm a wreck. Max is all well and rested, and I look like the one who's been shot." After the first story ran, Giovanna called the Riverfront Times to give them more information, because she felt Cassilly had glossed over his son's behavior leading up to the incident. She said, quote, "I would like to say that Bob could have expressed himself a bit clearer and said, 'It's an ongoing investigation. It's a miracle that Max is alive. He's recovering. We hope this is a turning point for Max, that he can stop drinking and whatever else he's doing.'" Gail Cassilly reached out to the media as well and said, quote, "There's nothing to be printed here until the police conduct an investigation and deem that there is something newsworthy. This is just people talking now, and it's hurtful, and it's not helping my son. In the meantime, opinions, comments, and stuff based not on fact are not appreciated and not at all welcome." She said Max was still recovering and not ready to talk to police. She also didn't appreciate Giovanna speaking out about Max. She said the restraining order had nothing to do with the shooting. Giovanna said she only wanted to help Max and brought up the threats against her once again, saying that she didn't take his threats against her personally, but rather saw them as a cry for help. She said, quote, "I wanted him to get some help. Now is the time for the parents to be pressing for the truth of what his activities are. It's best for Max." She said that Max had been getting himself into trouble, and she had been worried that something like this might happen. Eventually, Blake was charged, and the Riverfront Times clarified that it had been a robbery. An unnamed member of Cassilly's family told them that he did not know his attackers, while Giovanna insists that the attack was somehow related to substance abuse problems that she claims Max has. Blake was eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison for assault in the first degree, armed criminal action, first-degree burglary, and resisting arrest. In a 2016 interview with the Riverfront Times, John Blake claimed that he didn't even know the man who had actually done the shooting. He says that he showed up at the same time as him and forced his way into the apartment, then shot Max. Blake said, quote, "I couldn't tell you who he was if I saw him today." Max made a relatively fast recovery and would later describe the incident as a wake-up call, saying, quote, "It set my ass straight. It also brought him closer to his father." On September 24th, Max and Bob met up for lunch. That day, when they parted ways, Max unknowingly said goodbye to his father for the last time. On September 25th of 2011, Bob Cassilly was supposed to pick up his children from his in-laws' house, but he failed to show up. Giovanna became worried and called his friends and employees, but he was known to lose track of time, so it wasn't unheard of for him to ignore his phone. She called her neighbor to see if he was working late at Cementland. The anonymous neighbor went to go look, but it was night by then and rainy, so it was difficult to see into the site. The gate was padlocked from the outside, though, so she assumed Bob wasn't there. He didn't bother to lock the site while he was actively working, but would set the padlock to look shut. And he wouldn't have been able to lock the gate from the outside anyway, as his hands were too big to reach through the fence. The next day, at approximately 8 a.m., Rick Fortner, one of Cassilly's crew, went to Cementland to look for Bob, and ended up confirming Giovanna's worst fears. Fortner found Cassilly's body in the cab of his bulldozer. Initial reports said he was pinned under the bulldozer, but later reports said he was found in the cab. The next day, authorities told the media that Cassilly's bulldozer had likely slipped on a hill and flipped over before landing upright. Cassilly's body had remained in the bulldozer because the cabin was partially enclosed with a metal grate. A neighbor would later remark that from a distance, it looked like he was napping. Before he passed away, Bob had started adding man-made pyramids and faux Egyptian ruins to Cementland, as well as mounds to mimic those found near St. Louis. It made the terrain beautiful and otherworldly, but also hazardous to navigate in a bulldozer. Homicide detectives were on scene the day Cassilly's body was found, but the media reported that was largely just due to protocol. people were already calling Cassilly's death an accident. OSHA was investigating as well, because Cassilly had technically died in his workplace. When the medical examiners arrived to do their inspection, they were assured the bulldozer had not been moved. It was upright but leaning to the side at the bottom of a steep hill. They wrote that, quote, on initial examination, the exterior of the equipment was noted to have some damage, which could be consistent with rolling down the hillside. These damages were a cracked side mirror, a dented roof, and a pair of ear protectors further up the hillside that they concluded must have flown out while the bulldozer was rolling. However, they also wrote that, quote, I was unable to obtain information at the scene at the time of the investigation about the known previous condition of the equipment being operated by the deceased. This means the damage, which was not very substantial, could have already been present, but it was assumed the bulldozer had rolled over because of the fatal injuries Bob Cassilly suffered. The bulldozer itself was never examined by any experts or investigators to more thoroughly decide if it had indeed rolled over. Another strange aspect of the report was the investigator wrote, quote, it was unknown if it was owned or a rental. How much, if any, experience the deceased had on this piece of equipment was unknown to anyone interviewed by this investigator at the scene. Everyone in Bob's crew knew it was his bulldozer, a 1999 John Deere model that he'd had for many years and used frequently, so whoever the investigators spoke with did not know Cassilly well at all, and why they didn't question his crew is unknown. Giovanna had been out of town in Los Angeles when she got the phone call. She later told the Riverfront Times that, quote, I immediately packed my bags and headed to the airport. She and Cassilly had 2 young children together, Dylan and Robert III. She said, quote, I thought that eventually something like this would happen, but not this soon. I've never met anyone with his strength. He had a freaky amount of strength. Bob was a risk taker. Bob was invincible. He never wore a seatbelt. He never wore helmets. Giovanna broke the news to her children when she got back. Monday night, friends and family gathered on the City Museum's rooftop to reminisce with some of the staff about Bob. Mike Killian, who had known Cassilly for 30 years, said, quote, you think about him as this force of nature, and you don't think about those things having an end. Kurt Nickmeyer later told the St. Louis Magazine that, quote, autumn was his favorite time, when the hills and pyramids were still green, and you got these long shadows. I imagine the evening he died it was perfect. While this was a lovely sentiment, the police don't actually know what time of day or even what day Bob Cassilly had died. This question and others about Bob's death would not be brought up until years later, when his widow tried to have the investigation reopened. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which followed the life of Bob Cassilly very closely, published a heartfelt obituary, reminiscing about Bob's unusual life, his love for danger, and the way he shaped the city. They said, quote, Bob Cassilly's visions were bold, eclectic, and often chaotic, all harnessed to a go-to-hell attitude. He had little patience for the bureaucrats and lawyers with whom an artist and museum director must work. His work brought him fame, about which he did not care, and wealth, which he would leverage into his next project. He seemed most at home in jeans and boots, in the company of the artists and craftsmen who flocked to him, pushing boundaries to the last.
Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include the Riverfront Times and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. For a full list of sources or links to our contributors, please see our show notes. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.